You'd have to say the probabilities are that the government will win.
Devastation. And to watch their faces, it wasn't so much the losing, because, you know, we had our fair share of losing in past years, but it was the way we'd been decimated.
A moment of reckoning for Liberals. What really hurt the party faithful was the knowledge that more than any other election, this had been a case of losing the unlosable. Welcome to the program. The Liberal Party is in crisis. Defeat at the federal election just 3 weeks ago has shattered both unity and confidence. The leadership looks lost, policies are uncertain, the party's very identity seems unclear. Suddenly, Liberals are embracing Labor issues like the Republic and Labor tactics like federal intervention. The old verities and the older members are all under great pressure. Coalition partners, the Nationals, are watching this upheaval with growing unease. And out in the branches, the long-suffering Liberal foot soldiers are wearily trying to pick themselves up for the next battle. Tonight we look at how it all went so terribly wrong. With the help of party insiders on both sides of politics, Frank McGuire retraces a remarkable 6 months in Australian politics.
This was an election about trust and fear. The Liberals believed their time had come. They developed the ideas, the plan and the momentum to end Labor's decade of dominance. The Liberal Party had spent more than 10 years recruiting a team of economic rationalists who believed the free market would produce not only prosperity and efficiency, but justice. Their mentor in Parliament was Jim Carlton.
Well, we just had little meetings drinking Chinese tea in my office, and we just had what we used to call the nursery. I suppose we were a little pack of evangelists in a way, and we just tried to get, whenever new people were elected to Parliament, we'd invite them to join and talk about these things. We met with people outside.
Ladies and gentlemen, John Hewson.
As leader, John Hewson was the prototype for this philosophy, but many of the party faithful felt their ideas had been drowned out.
Well, I think they got too caught up in the big picture, you know, the macroeconomics and microeconomics and all that sort of economics, whereas for me, the household budget is my economics.
What about the people of Australia that want a decent future in this country?
The Liberal Party has played a key role in Jeanette Farrell's life for more than 20 years.
And I've just been saddened in recent times when I've started to see such a divergence between what I believe in and what the party seems to be publicly articulating.
No GST. I couldn't agree more. No government scare tactics.
While their public image exuded confidence and unity, only 6 months before the election, the Liberals were torn by dissent. The internal crisis destabilised the party and undermined its leadership. This is the inside story of how John Hewson lost the unlosable election, and it begins in a moment of triumph. When Jeff Kennett reclaimed Victoria, once the jewel in the Liberal crown, the party faithful believed he'd set the foundation for a federal victory.
The guilty party.
Jeff Kennett ran a textbook opposition campaign, revealing little about contentious policies and prosecuting his case that Labor was the guilty party for Victoria's financial disasters and should be punished by the electorate.
The guilty party. Going.
But only weeks after his decisive October victory, Premier Kennett revealed the tough, uncompromising face of new liberalism. Instead of laying the foundation for a federal victory, The divisiveness, confusion and fear Premier Kennett created with his new industrial relations laws provided Labor with the ammunition for a scare campaign targeting John Hewson. The union movement's intervention surprised no one, but divine intervention stunned the Liberals. The godsend for Labor came when the churches confronted John Hewson over the GST.
This particular form of a goods and services tax would work to the advantage of the rich and would disadvantage the poor and those on lower and middle incomes.
The problem was a big one because if the bishops appear to be saying that what you're doing is immoral, I mean, it was an incredible argument. It was immoral to tax food. I mean, we already were taxing food, we were taxing labour, and we were taking the tax off labour. It was astonishing. But whatever the basis of it, it just created a problem for us, and that added to the difficulties.
That did us a lot of damage, really.
Andrew Robb ran the Liberals' federal election campaign.
It created the perception that we somehow or other were being unfair. Now, it was a perception and it was sticking.
Liberal strategists feared Paul Keating would call a pre-Christmas election, and if the ALP concentrated its campaign on the GST on food, Labor would win. By early November, the polls had Labor in front for the first time in 2.5 years, a psychological shift that weighed heavily on the director of the Victorian Liberal Party, Petro Georgiou.
It was clear that in October, November, that both from the general public polls and from work that people were doing, that there was a significant fall in our support.
Enough fall to lose the election?
Significant enough to be worried about the trends that were quite bad at that stage.
During October, Georgiou secretly polled Victoria's 9 most marginal federal seats. The results told him the Liberals could lose up to 6 seats because of the GST. This was enough to cost them government. Crisis meetings were arranged, where Georgiou argued forcefully that his polling revealed people didn't understand the GST and were frightened of it. They were also immune to the promise of tax cuts, so the coalition's compensation for the GST was largely being ignored. But what did Dr. Hewson say in response to you and the strong feeling in Victoria that the GST was like an albatross around your neck?
I think when the perspective was put about the difficulties with the GST, Dr. Hewson, as always, listened, considered, and then took a decision.
What the Victorians, supported by my work and work from some other states, in fact, showed that we had some difficulties. The perception of us during those months was not as good as it should have been. We had some difficulties with the perception of the policy program. Now, a whole range of sort of options were being kicked around as to what we might do about it. But the principal one was that we ought to exclude food.
In fact, key Victorian Liberals argued for sweeping changes to Fightback. They wanted Dr. Hewson to dump the GST. In its place, they proposed a restructure of sales tax, smaller cuts in petrol prices, and scrapping the promised income tax cuts. They believed this package would be far easier to sell to the public. But I understand that the proposition that was put forward from Victoria was effectively to get rid of the GST itself.
No, but as I said, I really don't want to canvass the conversations that I had with John Hewson and the leadership.
Well, as I understand it, there was considerable pressure from the party machine by way of overtures in terms of suggested policy changes to put us in a more winnable position.
Victorian Liberal backbencher Ken Aldred had argued forcefully for major changes to Fightback.
Well, I think the pressures came in relation to Fightback as it stood from a number of major sources. They came from concern in the state divisions of the party. They came also from our coalition partners, the National Party. They came from the feedback that we were getting as members directly. They were coming from the business community and also, of course, from the very adverse polling that we were starting to get towards the end of 1992.
How fearful were you that the ALP would call a pre-Christmas election to cash in on the controversy surrounding the GST?
I thought it might happen, but the change in perceptions about our policies, it happened very quickly in that end of October, early November. They would have had to make a decision very, very smartly, and it would have been full of risks because I think we still had our nose ahead in a lot of seats. So I thought it might happen, but I didn't think they'd have the courage to do it, and I thought we had time.
John Hewson was so dogmatic about not changing his Fightback package that even key Labor strategists believed him.
I had some early warning, but it wasn't well sourced, that he was under a lot of pressure in that latter part of the year. I didn't bluntly think that they would necessarily succeed in getting him to shift, given the strong position he'd taken and the assertions he'd made about never moving.
The election reprieve was crucial for the Liberals. They now faced their moment of truth over the GST. John Hewson's intransigence panicked some backbenchers, and supporters of John Howard began counting numbers for a possible leadership challenge. What was actually happening as far as the head counting issue was concerned?
Well, I think members, as I understand, some members were being approached on the basis that the party was potentially in difficulty unless something was done, and particularly some of the Victorian members, as I understand it, were approached to that very end. I was not, by the way.
There was a suggestion at the time when the Liberal Party was considering whether it should change Fightback, and Dr. Hewson was seemingly reluctant to it, that people were actually counting heads for John Howard at that stage.
No.
Well, they were counting heads with the possibility that there could be a challenge.
Well, you always get those sorts of mutterings and speculation, but there was nothing in it.
John Howard has denied any involvement in such moves. Only hours before John Hewson announced he would finally concede to change, a news poll gave Labor a landslide lead of 7 points. John Hewson, the economic rationalist, could no longer deny political reality.
For the first time, the opposition leader has admitted his grand manifesto for reshaping Australia itself needs some surgery. He's promised to reveal details of the changes on December the 18th.
When he made the announcement, there was just tremendous relief. Tremendous relief. There was a great release and, of course, a great deal of worry in the Labor Party.
Former party secretary, Senator Bob McMullen, was a key Keating strategist.
Well, you could see pluses and minuses in that for them. Obviously, the most unacceptable feature of GST to the public was the tax on food, and that had been taken away. But it created two problems for them. One is that it undermined that impression of difference.
The internal crisis had passed, but deep concerns remained about trying to sell a GST during an election campaign. After being presented with hard evidence of its political danger, after being subjected to prolonged lobbying, John Hewson had finally compromised. But significant sections of the party feared he had not gone far enough, and this could still cost them government.
I thought, quite frankly, it was still going to be very difficult because there were still some elements in Fightback that were going to be very hard to promote in the electorate, and I had doubts also about their workability.
The dilemma for John Hewson was how to minimise policy changes, yet retain credibility and win the election. 3 days later, he made another strategic change.
John Hewson has signalled he'll reverse his Fightback promise to end the dole after 9 months.
The Fightback relaunch gave Dr. Hewson an immediate popularity boost. Then Paul Keating handed him an unexpected Christmas present by taking the spotlight off the GST and suggesting that everyone take a holiday from politics.
He let us off the hook, really. I mean, I couldn't believe it. I mean, in fact, he didn't mention it for not only for Christmas, but through about 5 or 6 or 7 weeks after that. And it meant that people went off and had their Christmas barbecues, talked about the changes we'd made. felt a lot more comfortable about it, talked about John Hewson, and without any opposition from the government. So I think he really did us a big favour, and I really was quite surprised at the way in which he acted in that case.
During the 3-week break, the momentum generated by the relaunch of Fightback shot the coalition to a 7-point lead. By the time Carmen Lawrence called the Western Australian election, the mood was grim for Labor.
It's going to be a very close campaign, obviously, and I think it's fair to say we're coming from behind. But
Western Australia was a lost cause. Nationally, unemployment was approaching 1 million, and Speaker Leo Macleay was embroiled in controversy over compensation for a bicycle accident. On February the 5th, Labor lost Leo Macleay. The next day, they lost Western Australia.
This is not Victoria, and I'm not Jeff Kennett.
A day later, Paul Keating took his biggest political gamble by calling the federal election. In this political climate, the polls predicted the end of the Labor era.
I think most people feel that time's up for Labor. They've had their chance. They haven't got a plan for the future of Australia.
While out on the hustings, Liberal candidates like Max Rawnsley knew their fate was tied to Dr. Hewson and the GST. Were you apprehensive at all because of the way the GST had been such an issue?
Yes, I think so. Yes, I think when there's a feeling of nervousness, there must be some slight lack of confidence in your own position. And certainly we had the GST we knew was going to be the issue. There was no way it wasn't going to be. The ALP is too astute for it not to be the issue.
We were ready for it, and I was just happy that we were starting to engage.
Well, when the campaign started, I had to say on the evidence I saw, I thought we were more likely to lose than win. I thought we had a chance, as I've said before, but I thought we were more likely to lose than win.
Well, very hopeful, very expectant. We had huge confidence in the team we'd put together. And you know, after a long, long time in opposition, after 4 election defeats, we thought victory was on our doorstep.
The campaign strategies highlighted the problems the parties faced. Fightback was too complex to sell, so the Liberals tried to convince the public to trust its salesmen.
We weren't going to sell it on 30-second sound bites on television. It was a big package which, in our view, would be very difficult for people to totally come to grips with by the campaign. They needed to trust the person who was going to bring in that policy. They needed to trust John Hewson in particular. So we put a lot of effort, and John put a lot of effort into designing a campaign where they got to know him. And he hadn't been around for a long time in political terms. They got to trust him, to know that he would be sensitive to the circumstances of people no matter where they lived, what they did.
So we had to negate, there was a wishful thinking that, look, maybe the GST is not good for me, but it'll be good for the country. We had to negate that.
Well, we're going to just talk about the impact of this GST.
Trapped by recession and with 1 million Australians unemployed after 10 years of Labor rule, the ALP exploited the fear of the unknown by attacking Fightback at its most vulnerable point, the GST.
How in any way can Dr. Hewson's policies bring them down?
What I thought we should have been trying to do, and at the end we were trying to do, was use it not just as the focus of the attack, but as a symbol on which, or as a platform on which other criticisms could be built that said, this is a rigid and ideologically driven and inappropriate package which will have adverse consequences economically and socially for Australia.
In that first week, we'd kicked off, as you know, with the economic initiatives and the childcare initiatives.
We had to do 2 things. One is we had to get some of our positives on the agenda early. Now, that seemed a bit unusual to people, of course, because we put things that would normally be in the policy speech were in the first week. But I think it was important for us to say we've got some positive messages on the record before we attack the other side. Everyone said we went around a very negative campaign. We actually spent a lot of days outlining new areas of policy.
It's official, 1 million jobless. And according to John Hewson, that means 1 million reasons for getting rid of Paul Keating.
Today you've got over 1 million reasons why it's time to change the government, over 1 million reasons why Labor ought to go.
you could say that at one level he was a bit cheeky in giving a mug 2 breaks by having 2 unemployment figures in the course of a campaign, and particularly figures of such, which we knew, of such magnitude. That was part of the unorthodoxy, I suppose, of the campaign, which probably defies, in many ways, description in terms of traditional campaigning or responses to it. It is an election unlike any other I've experienced.
As you know, 1 million Australians are out of work.
It really did set their campaign back that Thursday night, and we were in a position to run advertising at the same time. It gave us some initial momentum which we otherwise wouldn't have had.
I think the first debate was probably a 0-all draw, but it had its moments where one was encouraged because we started to get the key issues up in terms of their policies.
What happened was that in the first debate between Dr. Hewson and Mr. Keating, the one that John Hewson won, and won well, what you saw from that terrible worm on Channel 9 was that when the Prime Minister referred to the GST in derogatory and negative terms, the Prime Minister's approval went up. And you didn't need to be Albert Einstein to know that from Sunday night onwards, we could be in trouble. We could be in trouble if Labor picked up the GST as an issue. Because whilst 10% of the people are unemployed, 100% were going to be paying GST.
This is Labor's scumbag of scares. It's nowhere near as scary as it sounds. Just hit it with a few facts.
The Liberals had the momentum, while Labor was struggling to fulfil its strategy of making the election a referendum on the GST.
Day in the life of Dr. Hewson's GST, and not one new job created.
There certainly was a view that it was important by the end of week 2 to have engaged the opposition on the GST issue and made that the agreed battleground.
Labor strategists felt the election was slipping away, so they accepted an invitation to appear on a current affair.
We were headed for a landslide on the polls taken after the first debate that John won. We were 7% in front. John Hewson was headed for a landslide victory. And Labor panicked. They pressed the panic button, but it was the right button. It was the right button.
Well, you see, he was literally running throughout the whole campaign trying to avoid talking about his policies, and we couldn't allow him to do that. I mean, we thought we were behind, but within reach. And so it was a winnable operation, and what it needed was a focus on what was wrong with the alternative.
No, hang on, you start to go, John. Let's go on this. You've got electricity, you've got water, you've got gas, ironing, painting, plumbing, electrical work, dry cleaning, movies, swimming, sports, ballet. It's a lifestyle change.
Can I just give the detailed answer?
What Paul did was sort of, I guess, wrestle him to the ground on the GST and get it up as an issue, and it stayed up from then onwards.
The bathroom fittings, sales tax, showers...
By appearing on a current affair, John Hewson had fallen into Labor's trap. Paul Keating had succeeded in establishing the GST as the election issue.
It's going to raise $24 billion. Fact.
Well, you've got to play it as it comes. I mean, on that occasion, they were seeking to engage on GST, and to have not gone on, I think, could have been just as damaging or more damaging. The Prime Minister still would have had his half hour on GST, plus he also would have had the opportunity to say that we were running and hiding, which clearly we were not. So it was a useful ploy for them, but one in which you've got to play it as you see it, and I don't think we had a lot of choice.
You can actually pin the turning point in the election to that night. The Prime Minister performed at his rude and arrogant and best, but it didn't change people's perceptions of him, because they've always thought he was rude and arrogant. It did some good for John Hewson in the sense that people saw him as very feisty, very strong, and he matched it toe-to-toe with Paul Keating. But the one thing that came out of it beyond that was the fact that everyone started talking about the GST, and once they started talking about it, the hand grenade had gone off. And every day since then, or following then, Labor were on about the 15%. Everything was plus 15%. Immigration, plus 15%. Social welfare, plus 15%. You know, dogs up trees, plus 15%. Cats on roofs, plus 15%. And the ordinary person in the street was scared by it.
Labor strategists could hardly believe their luck when the resignation of the Canadian Prime Minister allowed them to again focus the election campaign on the GST.
At least the Canadian example demonstrates this point. It's bunkum to be arguing a monster spending tax can promote a recovery. We can say no. We've been warned.
It dramatised an already existing issue. I mean, it was a fantastic way to dramatise a pre-existing attitude. I mean, it didn't change the public's mind. There was already out there the view that this policy, not just the GST, but all those policies that went with it, had failed overseas. I mean, the public had a pretty rough working knowledge that that was right. But this was a dramatic personification of that failure.
It was a bonus that came out of left field. I mean, the all-time bonus that you hope will come your way during a campaign but never does. On this occasion it did. He'd been in power, as John Hewson and Peter Reith said. He'd been in power 10 years, unemployment was high, he basically had no plan for the future. It sounded very much like the Labor Party, but they were quick to get their line across that he was resigning because of GST. And again, I thought we handled that resignation very well in terms of combating the argument, but it was the more powerful, the more penetrating, effective use of the argument because of GST.
The policy launch was the Liberals' big chance to refocus the campaign on unemployment. To do this, they adopted a daring strategy to achieve two key objectives: humanise the leader and personify the problem.
I'm a dedicated farmer, but I'm sick and tired of belting my head against a brick wall.
And the stress it caused in the family finished our marriage.
During this waiting period, I was very angry, in a lot of pain.
It was risky. Yes, it was. Yes, it had its moments, but in the end, I think it worked. I mean, we got rather than a whole lot of promises and fistful of dollar stuff floating around, which people weren't buying off on anyway. We had a lot of coverage on the current affair programs in the newspapers of these real people addressing their problems.
These are the real people that are behind the horrific economic data we hear almost now on a daily basis.
But apart from the major parties, there was another force. The union movement focused on marginal seats. They concentrated on industrial relations and health. On the day of Dr. Hewson's policy launch, 75,000 workers demonstrated in Melbourne against the end of the state industrial award system in Victoria.
There are a lot of ingredients in winning an election, and you can't isolate or separate any of them out. It's silly to do that. But I think it's one of the critical factors.
And again, the GST blew up in John Hewson's face.
And you see, you talk about wanting to listen to real Australians. The real Australians are giving you the message you're not listening to. The real issue is GST, according to them.
We're getting in our research that that people thought maybe we were gilding the lily a bit by saying everything would go up, which we weren't, but we were saying things would go up because it was a 15% tax. They could identify, but they were also confused about other aspects of it. So I guess when he's on a major current affair program and subsequently another debate and on John laws, etc., as the campaign went through, not being able to explain a policy that he's the architect of, that's been around for 17 months, they probably feel a bit relieved, well, why should they understand it all? And if, I think as Paul said, if you don't understand it, don't vote for it. And I think that encapsulated that position.
To give you an accurate answer, I need to know exactly what type of cake.
But the worm was turning on the Liberals, and the worm was GST.
It's not presently subject to sales tax. It will not attract the GST.
But isn't that...
On a current affair, Dr. Hewson again found himself trapped in the trivial detail of the tax.
If the answer to a birthday cake is so complex, you do have a problem with the overall GST, don't you?
Well, the difficulty we've got in that example is people don't know how much tax they already pay.
This is the question for Dr. Hewson. Is it taxable? Is it GST-able? The answer is it is.
Attempting to cash in on Dr. Hewson's embarrassment, the Prime Minister was made to eat humble pie after his GST stunt backfired.
employ now another 40-odd people over the last 12 months. Now, all of a sudden, we're faced this year with a $45,000 payroll tax bill. To me, that seems immoral.
Last week, the statistician said we're growing at 2.4%.
The final charge to the ballot box began with the second great debate, as opinion polls showed Labor gaining in New South Wales, but the Liberals still expected to win.
It's denying the undeniable. Kerry, it's denying the undeniable. It's a bald-faced denial of the undeniable. And as well as that, we are...
He was not well all that day, or the next couple of days for that matter, but I don't think he considered at any stage that he shouldn't front.
But the economy's not growing. Look, there's been some measured growth.
It was clear that John Hewson did not want to be there under those conditions, and they didn't want him there. It was clear they were worried about him not being able to explain his own policies. So for the first half hour, he sat there like a dead fish. Clearly, body language saying, I don't want to be here, let me out.
Again, it got GST up at the start of the last week in a way which really set the pattern for the undecideds to spin off in the last week, and I think it was a big advantage to them in that sense. It got a negative issue up in a quite strong way.
Labor has to go! Labor has to go! Labor has to go!
During the last week, John Hewson largely confined his campaign to street rallies. He avoided the major current affairs programs.
That last week in public rallies was a disaster, in my view, for them and for John Hewson. We brought all that back. That if you dissented, you took off your jacket and jumped in the crowd and started ringing somebody for not agreeing with you.
Scum! Scum!
And I think it all that resurfaced, all those concerns about his personality and the absolutism of their policies resurfaced in that last week, and to their disadvantage.
Could you believe it?
I just wished that they kept the rallies going twice a day, let alone once. And I thought at some stage they would stop, but they didn't.
How significant were the rallies?
Well, that'll be debated for a long time, I think. I do think the earlier rallies were really quite successful. I mean, we were looking to, again, convey towards the end of a campaign that there was a lot of support for this program of change, which people still, in the main, didn't understand the totality of it. And we allowed Labor some advance warning on our program, and some of the TV pictures, I think, might have been counterproductive.
Did you think you should have changed when the last couple of rallies were showing images of divisiveness rather than a man you can trust?
The capacity to turn that around was pretty limited by that stage. And, you know, I think there really wasn't the opportunity to reverse the strategy in the last 2 or 3 days, even if we'd wanted to.
I thought we had an excellent week. I think Paul put in a flawless performance from the night of that Sunday night debate right through, and I think their last week was appalling, and I couldn't believe every night I watched them repeating and multiplying their errors, hoping they'd continue to do it right throughout the week, which they did.
You know, Mr. Keating's telling me that I should be in Canberra today talking with journalists.
While the Liberals were stuck with an inflexible strategy that was producing images of confrontation, Paul Keating was blitzing the media with his message that voters couldn't trust John Hewson.
He said, what could be worse than another 3 years of Labor? And it's a very simple answer, a GST forever.
The one thing that the Prime Minister is good at, I mean, I'm biased, so it's not much point asking me about what he's good at, because I don't reckon he's good at much, but the one thing he's good at is what you call the effective use of language. I mean, in politics, getting a message across is all about repetition, but penetration into people's minds through strong repetition of making words visualised for people.
The scramble for gain, based on avarice and greed, one group pitted against the other, all clambering, all clutching, all snatching, with heartless contempt for one's fellows. It'll be Gordon Gekko writ large.
I mean, the Prime Minister repeats the same point over and over and over again. I mean, if I heard once, I heard 1,000 times in relation to industrial relations. Do you want a cooperative, decent, caring society where Australian men and women are working together, or do you want the dog-eat-dog approach the scratch 'em, rip 'em down, tear 'em up approach of the opposition?
He's sitting on legislation which is complete and won't show it because he knows it's about cutting the wages and salaries of Australians to ribbons. He knows it's about cutting their wages and salaries to pieces. He's monkey cunning, he's hanging onto it, and he's sitting onto it.
It's repetition of a point in penetrating language to distinguish the two parties. And we've got to get better at that. We've got to get better at that.
All that I know is every time I watch television, Paul Keating was there saying GST, GST, GST. And if that's not enough, I'll say it to you for you 3 more times, GST. What time is it, Paul? Well, it's 3:15, and there'll be a 15% GST on everything. Yes, they were unremitting in that.
Did the Liberal Party ever have an internal poll that said it would lose this election?
On several occasions during the campaign, in the marginal seats, we had a 50-50 situation in a lot of seats. So we weren't exactly behind, but we weren't in front.
Did the ALP's internal polling ever say that it would win the election?
No.
It's the day before the election. It's been a tough, gruelling campaign. What goes through your mind right now?
Well, what a long journey it's been. 10 years in opposition. It's a long time and it's tough. But it's been a hard struggle over about 15 years to get the sort of ideas in place that I think are necessary to make the change we have to make.
As the man responsible for the coalition's transition to government, Jim Carlton believed he was about to fulfil a dream. His faction of free marketeers had won control of the Liberal Party. Now they appeared to be only one day away from winning control of the country.
I felt that we had to fight very hard, and that's quite difficult in a party. The other thing was that people were frightened of a lot of the ideas. A lot of them they didn't think were politically assailable. And, you know, we've seen quite a bit of that in this campaign. I mean, they are difficult to... Change is difficult to sell.
And GST included?
Well, of course.
10 years is long enough.
We're on our first booth at 7 a.m. in the morning. And I must say that we were shattered to arrive on the booths at that time and find that the ALP posters were on every booth.
They were using a little catch cry, vote Labor, vote against the GST and save Medicare. And I thought, oh, this is awful. So I'd give my pamphlet and say, you know, vote for employment, vote for Liberals.
You have to say the probabilities are that the government will win.
I went to Mass at 9:30 and I had my prayer book and my glasses. I knelt down and I started to cry. And I cried. And I cried. And I took my glasses off and I put my sunglasses on. And I continued to cry. And then I had to use my handkerchief. And friends came up to me and said, "Are you all right? Has someone died?" Well, then the heavens opened.
No, it's worse. The Liberals have lost.
Oh, devastation. There were people there who'd put in a great deal more work than I had. And to watch their faces, one fellow whom I've known for years, I just can't get his face out of my head. It was just like there'd been a death in his family. And that's how most of us felt. It wasn't so much the losing, because, you know, we had our fair share of losing in past years, but it was the way we'd been decimated. And then when the shock started to settle in, people were sort of saying to one another, well, you know, we never really thought the GST was a winner, but nobody would listen.
Some people we've spoken to just can't explain how the Liberal Party ended up with a goods and services tax.
Well, it gets back to one of the fundamental problems in the party, which is that the organisational wing, the average branch member, like your common garden member, has no say and really very little influence over the policies of the party. Now, that arrangement has to stop. There have to be changes, and the basic grassroots member has to have a say over policy. I mean, the days of policy solely being made by the parliamentary party at state and federal levels, those days have to be gone.
So you're still willing to fight on?
Of course. It's a relentless struggle.
And it has to have a human face. There has to be a human outcome to it. And I can still see that as a vision.
They should try and get people in the leadership that can articulate basically a middle ground position, because that's what this country is. And thankfully, the middle ground is the dictate, and they've not been able to understand that.
What we did was a betrayal of the Australian people. The Australian people did want to dispose of the Keating government.
The results of the leadership ballot for the Liberal Party this morning is Hewson 47, Howard 30, Reid 1.
I won't be announcing the Shadow Ministry for some time. We're going to have a two-day meeting next week to go through the election result as to why we lost and what changes we want to make.
Losing the unlosable. Frank McGuire was the reporter, and I look forward to your company again next Monday night, which of course is Easter Monday. Until then, good night.